Police Minister Bheki Cele says his department is turning the tide when it comes to tackling crime in the country. The Q1 crime statistics were announced yesterday, covering the period from the beginning of April to the end of June this year. The police have noted a slight decrease in violent crimes such as murder and sexual assault, but there's been quite a significant increase in attempted murder, robbery and common assault. Let's unpack these figures for you now. Bring in Annah Moyo-Kupeta, who's the Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, and joins us via our video link this morning. Great to see you, Anna. Thanks so much indeed for making time. You know, for people who don't spend much of their lives looking for these numbers to study them, it can be a bit confusing to gauge whether or not what the minister is saying is right. You know, he's communicating a message of things looking better in this country, but we've got an increase here, a decrease there, and I suppose for people who aren't, once again, in this field, it's difficult to tell. What's your reading of these figures?
Thank you, Ayanda. The statistics, of course, are showing a decrease in some of the crimes, as you've highlighted, and as the minister highlighted yesterday. However, this is not cause for rejoicing, because as we are looking at these crime stats, this is just quarterly stats, but violence still continues in communities. And also what we must take note of is that it's not all crimes that get reported to the police, particularly when we speak about gender-based violence crimes, for instance, or violence against women mostly. We know that only 1 out of 9 of these crimes get reported to the police. Perhaps the most accurate stats are the stats are related to murder crimes, for instance, because those have to be reported to the police, and for someone to get a death certificate, you need to have reported the case, for instance. So the stats are really still quite worrying, because in as much as we are seeing some decreases here and there, the decreases are quite small. But we are still very much relying on the criminal justice system to address crime and criminality in the country and the violence that we see in the country. As the minister noted as well, we are actually seeing that of the murder stats that have been reported, some of these are actually stemming from violent protests, for instance. And this is quite worrying because of the increase of the number of cases related to vigilantism or mob justice in the country, which point to specific socio-economic issues and challenges that we need to address as a country.
I'm so glad you went there, because part of what I found is interesting is that shoplifting has increased by around 19%. And in some instances, this form of crime is seen as petty crime, but points us to the kind of socio-economic conditions that push people to committing such offences.
Indeed, and we cannot use the criminal justice system alone to address some of these issues. We need to really use a multi-pronged approach that has us look at the socio-economic challenges and seeking to address them on the one hand, and on the other hand also really diving deeper into some of the key drivers and root causes of some of these crimes. And some of our studies at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation point to issues of structural inequality, the unequal existence, for instance, particularly of the majority of black people compared, for instance, to those who are privileged in the country. So when we look at some of these crimes that are called petty crimes, for instance, these are crimes committed, for instance, for purposes of survival by a number of people who really do not make ends meet in their own lives. These are issues related to livelihoods, for instance, and social issues that we need to address, for instance, and particularly coming out of COVID. We are 2 years now into the post-COVID era, but we are still seeing that levels of unemployment are still high. Unless we address some of the social issues and social ills in society, we will continue to see an increase in some of these crimes. And the criminal justice system alone cannot work. We cannot arrest everyone, for instance. Already we speak of our correctional services being full. We speak of overcrowding in these places. And there are calls now of actually decriminalizing petty offenses, because, again, it is akin to criminalizing poverty and criminalizing inequality, for instance, issues that we should be addressing by other means as opposed to actually relying only on the criminal justice system.
It's a fascinating point you make. So if we were to get a holistic picture of what's really taking place in this country, are you suggesting that these crime statistics should be viewed in light of, I don't know, the figures from the Social Development Department, for instance, about how much work is actually going into solving the deep inequality that exists in so many communities in this country?
Indeed, we should be looking at a holistic picture of what is happening in the country. We should be looking at how we are addressing the socio-economic issues. We should be looking at how, for instance, we are making opportunities available for the youth, for instance. We are making opportunities available, and also we are making social welfare available to people, particularly those who have been impoverished in the post-COVID era. So we really need to go beyond the criminal justice system approach to addressing crime and criminality in the country and addressing the very issues I've spoken about, the socio-economic issues and challenges that are quite rife in the country.
That said, and it's a point I've made before on this platform, many researchers are telling us that people nonetheless go and commit crimes if they believe they can get away with it. And sure, that may not necessarily be the work of police, but outside of, for instance, the numbers, insofar as crime is related, it'd be interesting to see how many of those who have been arrested because of these reported crimes are ultimately convicted.
Indeed, and that's an important point, because not everyone who gets arrested goes through the criminal justice system. There is also issues of corruption. There are issues as well of also the criminal justice system grinding very slowly. For instance, many people are in remand, many people are out on bail, and they become repeat offenders. But again, we have people committing crime as a result of socioeconomic issues that I've spoken about, lack of employment, wanting to make ends meet and so forth. So it's important that we really use what we call this multi-pronged approach to addressing crime and criminality and violence in the country. We also need to address the issue of normalization of violence in the country and really probe the question, why is there so much violence in the country? Unless we gain understanding, a deeper understanding on some of these issues, we will continue to treat symptoms, for instance, through the criminal justice system without really getting to the root of the problems and the issues that the country is facing. Yeah,
let me throw that back at you if I can, Anna. I mean, from the research you've been able to do, what are you able to find are the reasons that underpin how grotesque and violent the crime is in this country? I mean, there are people who will tell you that in other nations, for instance, somebody will stop you on a highway, take you out your car and drive off. But in a country like ours, they'll stop you at a highway, take you out of the car, possibly assault you, if not kill you thereafter. There's this almost extra step, it seems, criminals take to inflict pain and violence on their victims. Have we gotten anywhere near to understanding why that is?
Indeed, some of our studies that we have done have actually highlighted some of the root causes and key drivers of violence in society. And amongst these, some of our findings have highlighted that there is of course, our history of brutality and violence, which we have not completely broken away from in the post-democratic South Africa that we now live in. So that history of violence has continued, basically has followed us into the democratic era that we are currently enjoying. But at the same time, there are issues of unresolved trauma of our past that also end up manifesting in violence. So the psyche of violence is embedded in society, in our communities, in individuals, owing to some of this trauma that has not been resolved. But there's also the very issue of normalization of violence in communities, where, for instance, our children see violence on television. They see it on the streets, for instance, through mob justice and vigilantism. So this normalization of violence then has a ripple effect now of even the next generation becoming violent and taking violence as a way of relating, as a way of solving problems, perhaps as a language of enforcing something that citizens may want. When we talk also about our protests in South Africa, a constitutional right that citizens have, these tend to end up being violent, for instance, leading to killings of people, for instance. And again, the children are watching, teenagers are watching, everyone is watching this happening. Sometimes the youth are also partaking in some of this violence. So all of this circles back to the normalization of violence in our communities, in our societies, violence becoming some form of language that we use, for instance, to enforce something or to bring the government to the table of our concerns, of our grievances and frustrations, for instance. So we need to really address some of these issues if we are really to get to the bottom of why we are so violent and how can we collectively, effectively deal with violence in society, in communities, in our homes, and as individuals in a country like South Africa that actually had a brutal past but seeks to break away from this violence trajectory that we have seen continuing following us to our post-democratic era.
Insightful and incisive. Anna, thank you very much indeed for your time. Really do appreciate it. Annah Moyo-Kupeta is the Executive Director for the Center of the Study of Violence and Reconciliation.